Hello again, my dear students. In this video, you're going to learn more about bar graphs.
How do I structure my report? This structure keeps your report very organized. In the introduction, you're going to paraphrase the header or the rubric of the question given on the question paper. And in the overview, you're going to write 2 sentences that present general trends, whether upward or downward. You will highlight key features without mentioning numbers because you will be more specific about numbers in the 2 upcoming body paragraphs, where you can mention particular numbers, quotas, and percentages. You will also, and this is very important, include comparisons where relevant. How do I start? First thing that you have to do is to study the infographic. You have to look at what is illustrated, what is explained on the X and Y axes. For example, here I have the amount of money spent on the Y axis, and the goods or products this money was spent on the X axis. Not to forget that I have 2 different countries mentioned, France and the UK. I have to look at the peaks and valleys. Peak is the highest point in the graph and valley is the lowest. For example, the hottest year globally was 2016, where temperature reached its peak at plus 1.2 Celsius. And in both 2007 and 1998, it plummeted to just under plus 0.9 Celsius. This is a valley, or this is the lowest point in the graph. We do have to look at any stability aspects. A stability aspect, this is where there is no rise, there is no fall. It's flat, it's stable. For example, the numbers of elephants in Laos were stable in both years. Here it is. Another thing you need to look for is upward and downward trends. For example, we can clearly observe here that it's dominantly a downward trend, where the numbers of elephants fell in the majority of the Asian countries. So in India, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and China, numbers fell down. I do have to look at similar patterns as well and clear differences. For example, I have Malaysia and Thailand. Malaysia and Thailand were the 2 countries that lost the highest numbers of elephants. This way, I group up or I lump up the countries that share the same features. In the case of the given graph, it was the huge loss of elephants. For example, higher percentages of boys found going to parks and doing sports more entertaining, whereas girls enjoyed reading books and doing art crafts for recreational activities. The last thing we have to concentrate on is anomalies or exceptions. We mentioned previously that the general trend here is a downward trend. However, we can notice that the only country where the numbers of elephants showed signs of recovering was Cambodia. So this is an exception here. This is an anomaly. We have to look for those and highlight them whenever we find them. So now let's do a task together. I'm going to write this task with you. You're going to watch me, and after you finish watching, I would like you to try to do this the way I did it. The first thing that I have to look at is the question header. This is the question header that I'm going to rephrase in order to write my introduction. And this is my introduction. I wrote the bar chart sheds light upon. You can learn that expression, sheds light upon, the time spent by UK residents. The time spent by UK residents, this was not given in the rubric. This is something that I wrote. This is something that I paraphrased. And this shows the examiner that I have a range of vocabulary. And this is very important for my band score. On different types of telephone calls between 1995 and 2002. That's simply my introduction. For the overview and the two body paragraphs following, I am going to select and report the main features and make comparisons. You have to select, you don't have to write about everything. And you have to provide comparisons. These are very important, as I mentioned earlier. Here is my graph. For my overview, I noticed that local fixed line calls were the highest all over the period. I also noticed that towards the second half of the period, the gap narrowed. And so I wrote, it is evidently noticeable that local fixed line calls were the most popular all over the period in question. This is my first sentence. However, the gap between the three categories had narrowed considerably over the second half of the given period. You could learn expressions like evidently noticeable, all over the period in question, narrowed considerably, here is the narrowing, started to shrink, the gap or the difference started to shrink over the second half of the given period. Write them down and make sure you use them in your upcoming writings. So this is my introduction and this is my overview. As for my first body paragraph, I'm going to highlight or mention numbers for the highest category, which is local fixed line calls. It is also very important to mention the peak, as we agreed. 1999, this was the peak of the minutes spent on local fixed line calls. And I also noticed that the figure of 1995 was very similar to that of 2002. Speaking of national and international fixed line calls, I'm going to mention that it was a steady rise. Steady rise, it was not steep. Steep, this is when it's rapid, but steady, that is when the rise is slight or slow. And I'm going to say something about those last 2 years. And that's what I wrote. Local fixed line calls were the highest throughout the period, rising from 72 billion minutes in 1995 to just under 90 billion in 1998. After peaking at 90 billion in the following year, these calls had fallen back to the 1995 figure by 2002. Second in popularity, and this is comparison because I am comparing the one that was the most popular with the one that was second in popularity, and this is considered comparison. Second in popularity were national and international fixed line calls, which grew steadily. You can highlight that expression from 38 billion to 61 billion at the end of the period highlighted. The end of the period highlighted, that's a good phrase. Though the growth slowed, growth slowed. Please highlight this over the last 2 years. So these are 3 sentences included in my first body paragraph. And in this one, I talked about local fixed line codes and I compared it to the popularity of national and international fixed line codes. For my last body paragraph, I'm going to talk about or write about mobile calls. What I noticed was they started very little and they ended very huge. I mean, the minutes spent on them, they were very limited at the very beginning, and towards the end, they expanded. I also noticed that the rise was very slow, or the escalation was very slow in the first 4 years, which was very similar, and here is comparison, which was very similar to national and international fixed line codes. It is also noticeable that in the last 4 years, the time spent on mobile calls grew rapidly, whereas time spent on local fixed line calls gradually reduced. I'm going to mention the gap in billion minutes. That's what I wrote. Although mobile phones were the least used for communication, there was a dramatic leap. You can highlight this word, dramatic leap, and they're used from 2 billion to 46 billion minutes. Throughout the first 4 years, the rise in mobile calls, here I'm going to compare mobile with national and international, and here I'm going to compare mobile with local calls. So this is a very comprehensive paragraph that shows you how you can compare one item with both of the other items. So here I wrote throughout the first 4 years, the rise in mobile calls was as slight as that of their national and international counterparts, meaning that they both had slight rises, reaching approximately, and I like the word approximately, nearly, roughly. They are very good for statistics because they are never accurate. So you can use something like almost, approximately, nearly, and so on. 10 and 50 billion minutes respectively. The word respectively is referencing word. It refers 50 to the second in the list, which is national and international calls, and it refers 10 to mobile calls. You can go back to the graph to see what I mean. Over the second half of the period, connecting with mobiles rapidly gained popularity, whereas, and here we have comparison, local calls slowly lost theirs. The word theirs is a very good word. To limit the gap to only 25 billion minutes, and this is the gap or the difference that I told you about. It's 25 billion minutes. This is my complete essay. It's 216 words. That's more than 150. There is absolutely no problem if you write more than 150 as long as you're not making grammatical mistakes, you're not making structure mistakes, you're not making wrong choices of vocabulary. If you want to watch the video again, please go ahead, write down all the useful words, and try to use them in your writings. Thank you very much.